Welcome to a journey into the heart of power, ambition, and a king whose very name still echoes with the clang of history's great turning points. He was a man of colossal appetites and iron will, a figure so contradictory that he defies easy categorization. Was he the charismatic reformer who forged a modern nation, or the ruthless tyrant who tore his kingdom apart? Tonight, we peel back the layers of myth to reveal the true story of King Henry VIII, the monarch who reshaped England forever and whose shadow still falls across the world, even centuries later. Born on June 28, 1491, at Greenwich Palace, young Henry was not destined for the crown. He was the second son of King Henry VII and Elizabeth of York, merely the spare, a biological insurance policy for a new and still unsteady Tudor dynasty that had risen from the bloody Wars of the Roses just 6 years prior. While his elder brother Arthur was groomed for kingship, Henry lived a relatively carefree childhood at Eltham Palace, surrounded by the adoring women of his household, particularly his beloved mother, Elizabeth. She even taught him to read and write, an unusual and endearing detail for the time. This fair prince, however, was no ordinary child. He received a first-rate Renaissance education, fluent in Latin and French, conversant in Italian and Spanish, and learned grammar, rhetoric, history, philosophy, logic, and theology. But his talents weren't confined to books. Henry was a true Renaissance man, excelling in sports like hunting, jousting, wrestling, and tennis. He was also a gifted musician and composer, famously writing pieces like Pastime with Good Company. Scholars across Europe, including the famed Sir Thomas More and Desiderius Erasmus, marveled at his intelligence and charisma, describing him as a golden prince. Henry, by all accounts, was the coolest kid around, widely loved and admired. He adored theology and Catholicism, even earning the title Defender of the Faith from Pope Leo X in 1521 for his writings against Martin Luther. Then, in April 1502, fate intervened. Prince Arthur, just 15 and recently married to Catherine of Aragon, died suddenly, likely from the sweating sickness. Overnight, the 10-year-old Henry's life was turned upside down. The spare was now the heir. This trauma was compounded a year later by the death of his beloved mother in childbirth. His father, King Henry VII, became intensely protective, limiting the young prince's movements and forbidding him from dangerous sports like jousting. This period of indulgence, followed by sudden loss and restriction, left a deep imprint, fostering an immense desire for personal freedom and an absolute intolerance for constraint in his later life. On April 21, 1509, at just 17 years old, Henry VIII ascended the throne. The nation rejoiced, seeing him as a handsome, athletic, and intelligent king of dreams, a magnificent contrast to his fiscally severe father. One of his first acts was to arrest and later execute his father's unpopular ministers, Empson and Dudley, a chilling precedent for the ruthless elimination of those who stood in his way. Just 3 weeks after becoming king, Henry married Catherine of Aragon, his brother's widow, having obtained a papal dispensation to do so. Their lavish joint coronation kicked off a reign initially hailed as a continuous festival. In his early reign, Henry's court was vibrant, filled with lavish spending, jousting tournaments, and extravagant feasts, consuming an average of 5,000 calories of meat a day, with no vegetables for the rich. He sought to establish England as a major European power, engaging in costly wars with France, where he personally led campaigns like the Battle of the Spurs. While Henry pursued glory abroad, his wife, Queen Catherine, proved her mettle at home, serving as Queen Regent and famously overseeing the English victory against the Scots at the Battle of Flodden in 1513. She even sent Henry a bloodied piece of the slain Scottish king's coat as a trophy. Despite this early success and his genuine respect for Catherine, a deep anxiety began to grow. The purpose of a royal marriage was to produce male heirs to secure the dynasty, and in this, their union was a tragic failure. Catherine endured multiple miscarriages and stillbirths, and their only son, Prince Henry, died at just 7 weeks old in 1511. Although their daughter Mary was born in 1516, Mary's birth was celebrated, and she was initially treated as a true Princess of Wales. However, for Henry, coming from a dynasty with a tenuous claim to the throne and a recent history of civil war, a female heir was a terrifying prospect. By the mid-1520s, with Catherine in her 40s and hope for a male heir fading, Henry's thoughts turned dark. He became convinced his lack of a son was God's judgment, fixating on a passage in Leviticus that claimed marrying one's brother's wife would result in childlessness. This scruple of conscience was powerfully amplified by a new infatuation, Anne Boleyn. She was intelligent, cultured, and unlike Henry's previous mistresses, including her own sister, Mary Boleyn, and adamantly refused to be his lover, demanding nothing less than marriage and the crown. This audacious stance drove Henry to an overwhelming objective. He had to annul his marriage to Catherine and make his queen, a quest that became known as the King's Great Matter. In 1527, Henry formally petitioned Pope Clement VII for an annulment, but the Pope was caught in an impossible position. He was virtually a prisoner of Charles V, the Holy Roman Emperor and Catherine of Aragon's powerful nephew. He could not offend Charles. Henry's chief minister, Cardinal Thomas Wolsey, a butcher's son who had risen to immense power as Henry's loyal right-hand man, was tasked with securing the annulment. But Wolsey, despite his genius for administration and finance, failed. And Boleyn, who disliked the cardinal and was constantly whispering against him, seized the moment, and Henry, in his growing paranoia, turned on his old friend. Accused of treason, Wolsey died on his way to trial in 1530. Henry then seized Wolsey's magnificent palace, Hampton Court, as his own. Wolsey's downfall left Henry open to new, more radical advisors, like Thomas Cromwell and Thomas Cranmer, who offered a daring solution. If the Pope wouldn't grant the king his wish, the king must simply remove the Pope's authority from his kingdom altogether. With the path to a papal annulment blocked, Henry, guided by the brilliant and ruthless Thomas Cromwell, turned to Parliament to remake the English Church in his own image. Between 1532 and 1536, the Reformation Parliament systematically dismantled papal authority and transferred it to the crown. This was a legislative revolution. In May 1533, the new Archbishop of Canterbury, Thomas Cranmer, formally declared Henry's marriage to Catherine of Aragon null and void, and just days later, pronounced his secret marriage to a now pregnant Anne Boleyn valid. This was followed by the Act of Supremacy in 1534, which declared the king the supreme head of the Church of England, severing all ties to Rome. Refusing to swear an oath acknowledging this supremacy was now an act of high treason, punishable by death. Henry had effectively declared himself an emperor of his own empire. This pivotal moment set England on a unique religious and cultural path, leading to centuries of strife, but also laying the groundwork for English Euroscepticism, impacting even modern events like Brexit. By using Parliament as the instrument of his revolution, Henry inadvertently laid the groundwork for its future authority in the English Constitution. Henry's motivation for this seismic shift was not primarily theological, but personal and political. He wanted a divorce and a male heir, and if the Pope stood in his way, he would simply remove the Pope. Having become head of the Church, Henry then turned his attention to its wealthiest institutions, the monasteries. Between 1536 and 1540, over 800 monasteries, priories, and friaries were dissolved. This sweeping action was driven primarily by financial greed. The monasteries owned a quarter of all cultivated land in England, and their wealth would temporarily double the crown's income, funding Henry's lavish lifestyle and expensive wars. It also served to consolidate political control, as these institutions were bastions of Catholic loyalty. The justification given was moral and religious reform, though reports of corruption were likely exaggerated. Their riches were confiscated, and buildings stripped of valuables or left in ruin. This massive transfer of wealth created a new class of landowners, the gentry and aristocracy, whose fortunes were now inextricably linked to the Reformation, ensuring its long-term survival. This religious revolution was not met without fierce resistance. In the autumn of 1536, the Pilgrimage of Grace, a massive uprising of some 40,000 people, erupted in the conservative northern counties. The rebels demanded the restoration of the old faith and the monasteries. Henry, lacking the military strength to crush them outright, resorted to deception, promising pardons and a parliament in York. But once the rebel army disbanded, he reneged on every promise, unleashing a brutal wave of retribution, executing hundreds of leaders, including Robert Aske. Even his new wife, Jane Seymour, was warned not to meddle when she pleaded for the monastery's restoration, being bluntly reminded of Anne Boleyn's fate. The Henrician Reformation was enforced not just by legislation, but by terror. Henry's new treason laws redefined dissent as disloyalty, making it a capital crime to deny his supremacy or even remain silent when questioned. His reign saw an estimated 57,000 to 72,000 executions, cutting across all ranks of society. The judicial system became a ruthless instrument of conformity, with heads displayed on London Bridge as stark warnings. Among the most prominent victims were Sir Thomas More and Bishop John Fisher, executed in 1535 for refusing the oath of supremacy, signaling Henry's willingness to sacrifice even men of immense international prestige. And then, the ultimate betrayal and Boleyn. Her failure to produce a male heir, coupled with miscarriages, cooled Henry's passion, and her enemies, led by Cromwell, moved swiftly, and was accused of adultery, incest with her own brother George, and plotting the king's death, charges almost certainly fabricated. She was forced to watch as 5 men, including her brother, were executed for allegedly sleeping with her, knowing she was next. On May 19, 1536, and Boleyn was beheaded on Tower Green. Henry ordered a cannon to be fired at the moment of her death, marking his cue to move on. Just 11 days later, he married Jane Seymour. While physical torture was not a standard part of English common law, it was employed under royal warrant, almost exclusively in cases of treason within the Tower of London to extract confessions and information. Methods included the rack, a wooden frame that stretched the victim's body until joints dislocated and limbs tore apart, and the scavenger's daughter, an A-shaped metal frame that crushed the body into a ball, forcing blood from the nose, ears, and fingertips. And Askew, a Protestant gentlewoman, was famously tortured on the rack in 1546. When a lieutenant of the Tower refused to continue, the Lord Chancellor himself turned the handles, yet she never broke. Henry also inflicted profound psychological torture on his daughters, Mary and Elizabeth, publicly shaming them by declaring them bastards, separating them from their mothers, and forcing Mary to serve Elizabeth. This campaign of emotional abuse was designed to break their wills and enforce submission. The year 1536 stands as a brutal turning point for Henry, deeply intertwining his physical and psychological decline. In January, during a jousting tournament, the 44-year-old king suffered a catastrophic fall, his horse crushing him and leaving him unconscious for 2 hours. This accident reopened and severely aggravated a varicose ulcer on his leg that would plague him with chronic oozing and excruciating pain for the rest of his life. The injury also ended his athletic pursuits, leading to rapid and massive weight gain. His waistline ballooned from 35 inches to an obese 54 inches, and his weight approached 400 pounds. The stench from his festering wounds was so horrific that courtiers held perfumed handkerchiefs to their faces, and servants reportedly drew straws to avoid dressing him. Many historians now believe the head injury from this fall caused a significant traumatic brain injury, explaining his transformation from a charismatic golden prince into the suspicious, irritable, and ruthless tyrant of his later years. This neurological damage, compounded by constant, agonizing pain, intensified his paranoia and impulsivity. However, in October 1537, Henry finally got what he had desperately sought for decades, a healthy male heir, Prince Edward, born to his third wife, Jane Seymour. Henry was overjoyed, believing his dynasty was secured. But his triumph was short-lived. Jane died just 12 days later from postpartum complications, crushing Henry. He truly mourned her, considering her his only true wife, and later requested to be buried beside her. 2 years later, seeking a new wife for political alliance, Cromwell arranged a marriage with German Princess Anne of Cleves. However, Henry was instantly repulsed by her upon meeting, complaining she looked nothing like her portrait and exclaiming, "I like her not." The marriage was unconsummated and annulled just 6 months later, with Anne wisely accepting the annulment and becoming Henry's beloved sister, living a long and independent life. For this diplomatic disaster, Thomas Cromwell, Henry's brilliant but increasingly dangerous minister, was executed for treason just hours after the annulment on July 28, 1540. On the very same day as Cromwell's execution, Henry married his 5th wife, the vivacious teenager Catherine Howard. She brought a brief spark of youth to the aging king, but her past indiscretions and her foolish affair with a courtier, Thomas Culpeper, led to her downfall. When Henry discovered her betrayal, his infatuation turned to furious devastation. Accused of treason for adultery, the young queen met the same fate as her cousin Anne Boleyn, beheaded in 1542. His 6th and final wife was Catherine Parr, an intelligent and devout Protestant widow, whom he married in 1543. More of a companion and nursemaid to the ailing, obese, and tyrannical king, Catherine brought stability to the royal household. She was a kind and influential stepmother, helping to reconcile Henry with his estranged daughters, Mary and Elizabeth, and convincing him to restore them to the line of succession after Edward. Catherine, a dedicated religious reformer who even published her own theological works, nearly faced arrest for heresy when conservative enemies plotted against her. But she skillfully reconciled with Henry and survived him. In his final decade, Henry's health collapsed completely. His body was a battleground of ailments, chronic leg ulcers, recurring fevers, gout, and massive obesity. He weighed well over 300 pounds, requiring mechanical devices and several men to move him. His doctors feared him, not daring to suggest he was seriously ill, as criticizing the king's health was considered treason. In his last act of military glory, Henry personally led a costly siege against Boulogne in France in 1544, a victory that nearly bankrupted England and saw the city return to France years later. By late January 1547, the end was near. Henry, accepting his fate, asked for Archbishop Cranmer. By the time Cranmer arrived, the king was speechless, able only to grasp the archbishop's hand in a final gesture of acknowledgement. Henry VIII died in the early hours of January 28, 1547, at 55 years old. His death was kept secret for 3 days. Reportedly, his body was so bloated with gases that his coffin exploded during the funeral procession, splattering remains and causing a horrific stench, with dogs even seen licking up his leaked remains. This was a quiet, undignified end for a man who had lived his life on a grand and violent scale. Henry VIII's ultimate goal was to secure his dynasty with a line of male heirs. In this, he failed. He was succeeded, as dictated by his final will, by his 3 legitimate children, whose reigns would be defined by the very religious conflicts he had unleashed. His cherished son, Edward VI, became king at 9, pushing England further into radical Protestantism before dying at 15. His first daughter, Mary I, once cast aside as a bastard, claimed her rightful throne and brutally attempted to restore Catholicism, earning the grim nickname Bloody Mary for executing nearly 300 Protestants. She died childless. Finally, his second daughter, Elizabeth I, another child once declared illegitimate, inherited a divided kingdom. Her long and successful reign brought religious stability through a moderate Protestant settlement. And with her death in 1603, the Tudor dynasty, which her father had fought so brutally to secure, came to an end. Despite his personal failings and tyrannical nature, Henry VIII's reign fundamentally and permanently reshaped the English nation. His legacy is vast and multifaceted, laying the groundwork for the mighty England that would emerge in later centuries. His intensely personal quest for a male heir led directly to the break with Rome, creating the Church of England and setting the nation on a unique religious and cultural path with a monarch at its head, a structure that endures to this day. By empowering Parliament to legislate on matters of religion and succession, Henry inadvertently laid the groundwork for its future supremacy in the English Constitution. This concept of parliamentary consent would even be taken by English Protestants to establish North American colonies, influencing the future United States. He invested heavily in his navy, expanding the number of ships from a handful to over 50, founding new dockyards, and creating a naval administration. He is often called the father of the Royal Navy, establishing England's maritime power for centuries to come. The dissolution of the monasteries resulted in the largest transfer of property in England since the Norman conquest, creating a powerful new class of landowners whose wealth was tied to the new religious order. And he was a learned scholar and musician who generously patronized the arts, and his court was a center of Renaissance brilliance. He also ushered in practices like addressing the monarch as Your Majesty. King Henry VIII remains one of history's most compelling figures precisely because he embodies such profound contradictions. He was the epitome of the Renaissance prince, handsome, learned, athletic, and charismatic, who devolved into a morbidly obese, paranoid, and ruthless tyrant. He was a devout Catholic who, in his own mind, never stopped being one. Yet he destroyed the Catholic Church in his kingdom and executed its most faithful adherents. He was a celebrated humanist who ordered the death of his friend and England's greatest humanist, Sir Thomas More. His actions were driven by deeply personal, often selfish, and short-sighted motives. His colossal ego, his dynastic anxiety, his lust, and his terror of his own mortality. He sought to secure his own bloodline, yet the Tudor dynasty died with his children. He broke with one pope only to create a national church that would become a cornerstone of a global empire. Henry VIII's life is a powerful and terrifying testament to the capacity of a single individual's will to shape the course of history, unleashing forces and forging a nation in ways he never intended and could never have possibly imagined. Ultimately, Why are we still so fascinated by this infamous king? Because everything he did, and how he asserted his control and authority over everyone around him, has come to be viewed as the epitome of the word king. And yes, as the sources remind us, definitely because of the wife killings. If you found this epic journey through history as captivating as we did, hit that like button and subscribe to our channel for more dramatic historical stories. Don't miss out on what's next.